Excerpt from A Long Way Gone by Ishmael Beah. Most of my friends, after meeting the woman who I now think of as my new mother, a Brooklyn-born white Jewish American, assumed that I was either adopted or at a very young age, or that my mother married an African man. They would never imagine that when I was 17, I came to live with her and that I had been a child soldier and participated in one of the most brutal wars in recent history. In early 1993, when I was 12, I was separated from my family as the Sierra Leone Civil War, which began 2 years earlier, came into my life. The rebel army, known as the Revolutionary United Front, or RUF, attacked my town in the southern part of the country. I ran away along paths and roads that were littered with dead bodies, some mutilated in ways so horrible that looking at them left a permanent scar on my memory. I ran for days, weeks, and months, and I couldn't believe that the simple and precious world that I had known, where nights were celebrated with storytelling and dancing, and mornings greeted with the singing of birds and cockcrows, was now a place where only guns spoke, and sometimes it seemed even the sun hesitated to shine. After I discovered that my parents and two brothers had been killed, I felt even more lost and worthless in a world that had become pregnant with fear and suspicion, as neighbor turned against neighbor and child against parent. Surviving each passing minute was nothing short of a miracle. After almost a year of running, I, along with some friends I met along the way, arrived at an army base in the southeastern region. We thought we were now safe. Little did we know what lay ahead. 1994, the first battle. I have never been so afraid to go anywhere in my life as I was that first day. As we walked into the arms of the forest, tears began to form in my eyes, but I struggled to hide them and gripped my gun for comfort. We exhaled quietly, afraid that our own breathing could cause our deaths. The lieutenant led the line that I was in. He raised his fist in the air and we stopped moving. Then he slowly brought it down and we sat on one heel, our eyes surveying the forest. We began to move swiftly among the bushes until we came to the edge of a swamp, where we formed an ambush, aiming our guns into the bog. We lay flat on our stomachs and waited. I was lying next to my friend Josiah. At 11, he was even younger than I was. Musa, a friend my age, 13, was also nearby. I looked around to see if I could catch their eyes, but they were concentrating on the invisible target in the swamp. The tops of my eyes began to ache and the pain slowly rose up to my head. My ears became warm and tears were running down my cheeks even though I wasn't crying. The veins on my arms stood out, and I could feel them pulsating as if they had begun to breathe of their own accord. We waited in the quiet as hunters do. The silence tormented me. The short trees in the swamp began to shake as the rebels made their way through them. They weren't yet visible, but the lieutenant had passed the word down through a whisper that was relayed like a row of falling dominoes. Fire on my command. As we watched a group of men dressed in civilian clothes emerge from under the tiny bushes, they waved their hands and more fighters came out. Some were boys as young as we were. They sat together in line, waving their hands, discussing a strategy. My lieutenant ordered a rocket-propelled grenade, RPG, to be fired, but the commander of the rebels heard it as it whooshed its way out of the forest. Retreat, he called out to his men, and the grenade blast only got a few rebels, whose split bodies flew in the air. The explosion was followed by an exchange of gunfire from both sides. I lay there with my gun pointed in front of me, unable to shoot. My index finger became numb. I felt as if the forest had turned upside down and I was going to fall off, so I clutched the base of a tree with one hand. I couldn't think, but I could hear the sounds of the guns far away in the distance and the cries of people dying in pain. A splash of blood hit my face. In my reverie, I'd opened my mouth a bit so I tasted some of the blood. As I spat it out and wiped it off my face, I saw the soldier it had come from. Blood poured out of bullet holes in him like water rushing through newly opened tributaries. His eyes were wide open. He still held his gun. My eyes were fixed on him when I heard Josiah screaming for his mother in the most painfully piercing voice I had ever heard. It vibrated inside my head to the point that I felt my brain had shaken loose from its anchor. I searched for Josiah. An RPG had tossed his tiny body off the ground, and he had landed on a tree stump. He wiggled his legs as his cry gradually came to an end. There was blood everywhere. It seemed as if bullets were falling from the forest, from all angles. I crawled to Josiah and looked into his eyes. There were tears in them, and his lips were shaking, but he couldn't speak. As I watched him, the water in his eyes was replaced with blood that quickly turned his brown eyes red. He reached for my shoulder as if to pull himself up, but midway he stopped moving. The gunshots faded in my head, and it was as if my heart had stopped and the whole world had come to a standstill. I covered his eyes with my fingers and lifted him from the tree stump. His backbone had been shattered. I placed him on the flat on the ground and picked up my gun. I didn't realize that I stood up to take Josiah off the tree stump. I felt someone tugging at my foot. It was the corporal. He was saying something that I couldn't understand. His mouth moved and he looked terrified. He pulled me down, and as I hit the ground, I felt my brain shaking in my skull again, and my deafness gave way. Get down, he was screaming. Shoot, he said, as he crawled away from me to resume his position. As I looked to where he lay, my eyes caught Musa, whose head was covered in blood. His hands looked too relaxed. I turned toward the swamp, and there were gunmen running, trying to cross over. My face, my hands, my shirt, and my gun were drenched in blood. I raised my gun and pulled the trigger, and I killed a man. Suddenly, all the death I had seen since the day I was touched by war began flashing in my head. Every time I stopped shooting to change magazines, I saw my two lifeless friends. I angrily pointed my gun into the swamp and killed more people. I shot everything that moved until we were ordered to retreat because we needed another plan. We took the guns and ammunition off the bodies of my friends and left them there in the forest, which had taken on a life of its own, as if it had trapped the souls that had departed from the dead. The branches of the trees seemed to be holding hands and bowing their heads in prayer. In the swamp, crabs had already begun feasting on the eyes of the dead. Limbs and fragmented skulls lay on top of the bog, and the water in the swamp was stagnant with blood. I was not afraid of these lifeless bodies. I despised them and kicked them to flip them and take their guns. I found a G3 and some ammunition. I noticed that most of the dead gunmen and boys wore lots of jewelry on their necks and wrists. Go ahead and continue reading the rest.